Ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to or watching the School of Scott. Today we have a very special guest, the great JJ Zachariason, quarterback expert, aka late round QB, has maybe the best fantasy podcast in the game, a recent best ball bro. And also, I tell this story every single time. JJ gave me my start in this industry. I started over at Number Fire for him back in the day, and he has a coaching tree that would rival better than Shanahan, I would say. You wouldn't have a Graham Barfield, you wouldn't have a Scott Barrett, you wouldn't have a Rich Rebar, plenty of other names if it wasn't for JJ. What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
JJ, how are you doing?
Good, man. Good. There's so many people that we could sit and name. It'd be like a remember these guys, kind of back and forth, because some have fallen and some don't, are smartly not doing anything in the fantasy space anymore. But it's great to chat with you, man.
Yeah. I know I tell this story every single time, but so I was not immediately good as a fantasy writer. I was not one of the stars at Number Fire, and for 2 years, I just struggled. I just wasn't clicking. Zero growth from maybe my first article was good. Zero growth from then on, and you were really heavy-handed in edits. Like you sat with me for hours trying to get it to a point where it was publishable. And then finally, I wrote this one Frank Gore article where he was a value at 43 years old. I think it was his last good year, and it felt good coming off of the club. And you were like, Scott, this is great. And then it was just downhill from there. It was just easy. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember it vividly, man. And you were doing some baseball content at the start too. I remember you wrote a Tanaka article at one point. Yeah, man, those were the days. Just a lot of smart people coming through Number Fire that now have full-time gigs in the space. I mean, let's not forget Chris Raybon either, who's doing more on the betting side now. But yeah, I remember that very vividly, of sending that email, just being like I wanted to just hold you and shake you and just be like, yes, this is it. It clicked, you figured it out. But yeah, man, those were the days of really going hard with the editing stuff.
Today, I want to dive a little bit into positional value. I think no one does it better than you. I think you're the perfect person to talk to about that. And I want to start with the quarterback position. So when I was reading your draft guide, what really shocked me more than anything was your track record as a streamer. For the folks who don't know, you've had a long-standing podcast going back to 2015 called Living the Stream. You want to tell people what that podcast's about?
Yeah, we started it maybe 2013, end of 2012 season maybe, but we didn't start really tracking heavily, I think, until 2015-ish. But yeah, what we do is that we go into a given week and we give recommendations at quarterback, running back, or quarterback, tight end, and defense. Sorry. And we look at the waiver wire and find lower rostered players, and we say, hey, based on these lower rostered players, because in a single quarterback, single tight end league, normal formats, they're the onesie positions, as we've dubbed them. And they're the positions that are in lower demand because you're only needing to start one of them. And when there's something that's lower in demand, that means there's going to be hypothetically an excess of supply of that position. And so, in your home leagues, you guys have seen this through the years where you can go to the waiver wire and find a tight end that can match tight end X production, or you can go to the waiver wire and find a quarterback to match QB 9, whatever it is in a given week. There's a lot of math behind as to why quarterback in particular, it can work. The streaming stuff can work, but I've been tracking our picks for about 9 years now. And I do that for obvious reasons. I think it's, we always kind of write in hypotheticals when we're doing our breakdowns and stuff, where we're doing hindsight analysis a little bit. We can look at things like start rate and stuff on these different platforms, but how reliable is that whenever you're talking about teams that, aren't necessarily as active or as into fantasy as we would be per se. Right. And so if it's coming straight from us in our analysis, then we know that this is how we would be playing things. And so, yeah, through the years, we've had some success streaming. I don't know what the baseline would be or like what other people could do. But there's been years where we had like QB6 equivalent in points per game. There's been years where, the last few years it's been more like QB11, QB12 ish, like lower end QB1 type production. The one thing I'll say too, though, is that with the streaming stuff, we don't have the benefit of, okay, we picked up CJ Stroud last year, we're just going to ride him through the end of the season, or Brock Purdy. We streamed we streamed CJ Stroud, we streamed Brock Purdy, we streamed Jordan Love, but eventually too many people have those three players. And so you can no longer recommend them, on the show as streamers. So we're actually at a slight disadvantage with some of those numbers. You could argue that those numbers should be a little bit better, but overall, like, we've been able to at least give you, and I published this in the guide. This is the first year I actually did publish it the way that I did, but like, you can sort of see what the baseline quarterback would be if you're calculating VORP or something, because we're literally showing you what the baseline quarterback is by picking guys off the waiver wire.
This was like so mind blowing to me. You have the numbers right here. So since 2015, going in order from 2015 to 2023, you've streamed the equivalent of the QB8, QB6, QB6, QB10, QB7, QB15, QB12, QB9, QB13. So it's like, what's your floor? If you literally draft 0 quarterbacks, sounds like you're going to get like a mid to late QB1. And like that's amazing. And you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. So you could do even better than that. You could have just held on to CJ Stroud. You could have just held on to Purdy or Jordan Love and like maybe held on to 2 of them and then played the matchups between them and given yourself, QB4. And so, yeah, that was one of the most mind-blowing things to me.
Yeah, the thing is, like, the numbers have gotten worse over the last handful of years, over the last 4 years, right? It's been QB15, QB12, QB9, QB13. And there's definitely reasons behind that. Those reasons being that quarterback has become more predictable within the market. People are understanding what matters at quarterback. It's really all started after Lamar Jackson's big MVP season. People really just started to understand that mobility at the position matters. And now we have these unicorns who can throw and run the ball really well. And so the reason why these numbers, I think, have been getting worse is because kind of a few things are happening. Like, the market itself, like through the waiver wire, is getting sharper. That's one thing, right? So like, you're not as easily able to find quarterbacks probably off the waiver wire. But then also what's going on is that the good quarterbacks are just being drafted earlier in fantasy football. There's charts within the guide too that show, the R squared between ADP and postseason result. And at quarterback over the last 4 years, it's gotten stronger than what we saw. Like, literally, dude, like in 2015 and 2016, the R squared between top 18 quarterbacks and points per game was literally 0. There was 1 year where the bottom half of that group of 18 scored more fantasy points than the top half did, because the mobility wasn't there in number one, like to the degree it is now. And so you're not getting that like baseline and that predictability. Passing numbers are really, really volatile, but also fantasy managers just sucked. They were just not very good at understanding like which quarterbacks were good. But now, it's a totally different game.
I feel like the people listening to us are like the uber nerds, the super degenerates, hardcore fantasy players. But if you're in a casual league, let's say you're in a 10-team league, quarterbacks typically fly in your draft. Can you take a Josh Allen round 2? Or what if you're on FFPC where quarterbacks are going really like Josh Allen is going round 4? Do they have permission to draft one of these highest end quarterbacks? And here's the argument I'll say is that in like 11 of the last 12 years, you're always better off being one of the last people in your league to take a quarterback than one of the first. And 2 years ago was one of those outlier years where it was Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, all the way at the top, Joe Burrow, all the way at the top. And you could argue that like they're putting up more points relative to baseline quarterbacks. And then there's the predictability of that production. So where do you stand on high-end quarterbacks?
I think the predictability part is what's most important. Like, when you look at the way that I sort of do this analysis is that instead of looking at like QB1 versus QB12 and looking in hindsight and like finding VORP that way or whatever baseline you want to use, I try to shy away from doing that because the QB1 could have an outlier season pretty easily. Like, we're going to probably see, whether it's like Lamar's MVP, his first MVP season where he scores like 28 points per game or whatever it was, something stupid like that. I don't want to skew that data. So what I do is I look at QB1 to QB3 and I average their points per game average together. And I compare that to QB10 to QB12 and I average that together just to kind of look at a very quick VORP related way. Cause I have plenty of reasons that I don't enjoy or like love VORP analysis, but that's one way to just kind of get a general idea of like how big of an advantage that position was really giving you, in that season or across seasons, whenever you're looking, from like I look from 2014 to 2022 or 2023 rather. And so, looking at the last 10 years, the gap, whenever you do that calculation, the gap in points scored, there'll be some years where there's like a bigger gap and then there's some years where it's a smaller gap. And overall though, there's been a pretty flat trend where there's not necessarily this massive advantage of in terms of points per game difference from what we saw last year or the year before. Like the year before that was pretty good, but what we see from the top quarterbacks versus a baseline, what we've seen in recent memory versus 2012, 2013, 2014, right? The difference though is the predictability aspect, because now we have these unicorns who are consistently being that dude, right? And they're consistently giving us rushing production. The question I always ask people, I mean, it's an insert quarterback here, but if we're looking at Kirk Cousins versus Kyler Murray, and you say, hey, who's going to throw more passing touchdowns? Maybe people would favor Kirk Cousins at 60-40 or something like that. Maybe Cousins isn't even the best example. Let's just say Brock Purdy. Maybe people would say, yeah, Brock Purdy will throw more touchdowns than Kyler Murray. But there's a caveat of Kyler Murray can still throw more touchdowns than Brock Purdy this year, and no one would be like that shocked if something like that happens. Now, if you ask the same question and say, who's going to have more rushing production, Kyler Murray or Brock Purdy, 100 out of 100 people who know ball will say Kyler Murray, right? And the reason for that is because rushing production is stickier than passing production is. And so if all of these good quarterbacks are now being pushed up because of their rushing production, what that tells us is that they're going to be more predictable with their output, and we're not going to see as many late round quarterbacks necessarily emerge. Like everyone points to like Jordan Love and Brock Purdy and CJ Stroud last year, which they had their moments. Like Jordan Love's second half of the season was great. Don't get me wrong. But across the entire season, they weren't that great. Like they weren't bad, but they were like 18 to 19 point per game quarterbacks, which is not that far off from what we got out of our streamers throughout last season, right? And so the bottom line is like we're trying to get to 20, 21, 22 points per game with our quarterbacks to have any sort of edge. And if we know that predictability aspect is going to favor the mobile quarterbacks, we got to kind of pay up for the mobile quarterbacks because that's what the market is telling us to do, right? And so a guy like Josh Allen, a guy like Jalen Hurts, if you're getting into the third round where historically round 3 in a 12-team league in a normal draft, that's where we're going to start to see like opportunity costs start to fall because hit rates at running back and wide receivers start to fall around then. That's when I say, okay, and then you can look at my rankings. Like I have Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen in that like 28 and 30 range, because once you get into that middle of the third round based on history, and even if you look at the landscape this year, that's when we start to see that drop off. And that's when I'm like, okay, because of the predictability, because of their mobility, I'm okay with going after those guys in that range.
So I was going to save this towards the end of the show, but I think it works better here. So what is like your preferred quarterback strategy in your own drafts? And is there one quarterback you're targeting far and above the rest?
Yeah, I think that before, when I would go on shows 10 years ago, I'd just say, get your quarterback late and log out, right? Like, don't even worry about the quarterback. It doesn't matter. And then, you'll see some like, analyst leagues where you can wait because that teams aren't going to take backups and stuff, and it's not that big of a deal. But if you're talking about like your home leagues or just a typical, like even FFPC league, where that people are going to be taking backup quarterbacks because the rosters are so deep, I just think there's pockets of quarterbacks, right? Like there's areas of the draft where it's like, okay, this is where the elite quarterbacks are going to sit. One of the big 4, let's say, or if you want to say the big 2 and then the next 2 or something like that. And then there's some players that historically are part of an archetype that usually gets kind of destroyed, like a CJ Stroud type, a pocket passer that goes in the top 6, historically has been a very, very bad bet in fantasy football. Like high-end QB2 mobile quarterbacks over the last 10 years have been better bets to hit a ceiling than pocket passing top 6 quarterbacks, like period. They've been a better bet by far. And so, a guy like CJ Stroud, where he goes, you're just sitting there, you're like, I'm not going to get Stroud unless he falls, because his outcome is not going to necessarily be that much more significantly different than other pocket passers or a mobile quarterback that I can get a little bit later. So you're kind of going through your draft and picking out these pockets. You get then to this year, who I think is by far the best value on the board is Kyler Murray. And to me, it's sort of, Kyler sort of has the Jalen Hurts before his breakout when he was like QB8 or whatever, Josh Allen before his breakout whenever he really broke out, and not quite Lamar because his ADP isn't as low as what Lamar's was during his first MVP season. But man, Kyler looks like the most obvious pick at his ADP, because I like when you look at what he did last year, he steps in, coming off this crazy knee injury. He has no weapons in this offense that are like solidified, right? And he steps in and he gives us 18.3 points per game off of in a new offense coming off of this knee injury. And then, you look at how he did it. He had a 3.7% touchdown rate, which is pretty putrid. He had a yards per attempt that was below 7. And you ask yourself, well, how did he do this? How did he score over 18 points per game? It was his legs. He scored over 5 points per game with his legs via rushing. Since he entered the league 5 years, he's been over 4.9 points per game with his legs every single season. He's been over 5 in 4 of those 5 seasons. There's been 35 quarterbacks since 2011 who have hit 300 plus pass attempts. So they were a starter for most of the season, who then also had 5 or more points per game with their legs. 20 of the 35, Scott, ended up scoring 20 or more points per game. So I think that we would probably assume that Kyler Murray is going to throw for 300 attempts because he's a starter, right? He's hit 5 or more points per game basically every year of his career. And 20 of the 35 players who have done that since 2011 ended up giving us high-end QB1 production. Like, Kyler Murray right now is being drafted at his floor for the most part, if he's healthy, right? And if to me, honestly, I don't really see, and maybe this is kind of spicy, I don't see that dramatic of a difference between Kyler Murray and Anthony Richardson. And maybe that's wrong to think that way, but I think there are reasons to be a little bit more bearish on Richardson than the market is generally being, even though I know rushing production matters so much, which is why I'm not going to sit here and tell anyone don't draft Anthony Richardson. That would be kind of absurd, I think. But I do think I would say draft Kyler Murray at cost well over Anthony Richardson at cost.
Yeah, I think that's a great call. QB 10 on ESPN. Since 2020, he ranks 3rd among all quarterbacks in fantasy points per game, ahead of Lamar Jackson. Keep in mind, like you said, he was clearly hobbled last year, wasn't fully back from that ACL, and now a massive upgrade to his supporting cast. So I think that's a great call.